in and out of the Beltway. From large cities to small towns to the rural heartland. From sea to shining sea. This is Wehman, Brunson, and Vernuccio. Inside the News.
Welcome back to the program Inside the News. Glad to have you with us. It's another beautiful week on the radio. We have so much going on, and on AUN TV, that's our new TV home, as well as YouTube. Want to thank you so much. If you're listening to us on the radio, you can find us on the AUN TV network out in Northern California or YouTube around the world. Look for WBV Inside the News. On the top left of your screen, you see Mr. Frank Vernuccio, and in the bottom middle, we have Ben Brunson. How you doing, Ben Brunson?
I'm doing just great, gentlemen. Once again, pleasure to be with you both.
Absolutely. And Frank, how you doing up there?
Great to be with you. And to our audience in Northern California, we're the voice of sanity that you've been missing.
Yeah, boy, isn't that the truth? You know, there's pockets of California that have pockets of, I mean, they have those areas of sanity there, Frank. But we tell it like it is, don't we, Frank?
Yeah, we certainly do. And, you know, if you go actually to our first topic, it is fascinating if you review how the media reported President Trump's speech at Mt Rushmore. First of all, the thought of an American president giving a 4th of July speech at Mt Rushmore somehow being controversial is topic number one in the irrationality of the media. But topic number two was the way the speech was reported. It was a pretty standard speech. It was well delivered, well done. The president talked about all the great figures of America, both black and white and every other color. And somehow or other, the media decided that that was a divisive speech. Kind of boggles the mind that the Times and others could call a fairly standard July 4th, we're all great American speech divisive.
Yeah, and Ben, just to take off on Frank's point before we start getting deeper and going inside the news, it was really kind of neat seeing the backdrop of the presidents and the president there at Mount Rushmore. I think it's a beautiful place. And yet, Frank made a good point about the media, didn't he?
Well, the media has cast their lot with the revolutionaries, which is really what's going on in this country. A small percentage of the left has hijacked the entire Democratic Party, and the Democratic Party has hijacked the left-stream media. And so the narrative is set, and the war for the future of America is on.
Boy, it sure is. Okay, the war for America. Frank, let's dig into it, how the July 4th affected the country. And then I also want you to bring in the Colin Kaepernick, where he actually quoted this, and it was put out on the Hill, and many people saw what he said. He said, "We reject your celebration of white supremacy." Wow, that's something coming from him, isn't it?
Well, it's a concept that the left-wing academia has been pushing for a long time. They reject everything about the United States. They have tried to rewrite history in a totally false narrative, alleging that somehow or other there's no history of America other than that of racism, which is, of course, absolute nonsense. Let's be blunt. In the course of human history, there is no greater advance in human freedom than the words written by Thomas Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence, the Bill of Rights, and the Constitution, and the perfection of both of those documents by the results of the war of the Civil War in the 1860s. The fact of the matter is, the academia has raised now 2 generations of students who know nothing about the true history of America, whose only assumption about America is what they've heard from their addle-brained professors who hate everything that we are. This is not something new. Look, the concept of individual freedom is still a new one in human history. It began in 1776, and it has really not been accepted by a large part of the population, even here in the United States.
You know something, Ben? when Trump has to, he delivers some of the most outstanding speeches, and he delivers it in such a way. Let's go back to Poland and what he did there, and some of his State of the Union messages, and then this one at Mount Rushmore. This many people have commented how good it was, and yet the media is trying to say it's dark, it's divisive, and yet we did not find it that way, nor did, I think, middle America. There's a silent majority. We'll talk about that in the third segment, but would you agree about this speech, Ben?
I would call this speech he gave at Mount Rushmore one of the greatest speeches by an American president in my lifetime. And he has occasionally given incredible speeches.
Mm-hmm.
That was the right speech at the moment. He gave a great State of the Union speech a couple of years ago, and the press reacted the same way then, that it was and driving the country apart. And in fact, his speeches are just the opposite. And for the vast majority of Americans who listen to his speeches, I think they hear what the president intends for them to hear. The fact that we deal with people like Colin Kaepernick and the revolutionaries who are leading this current movement, unfortunately, the press is giving them so much credence that it gives them undue influence. The irony of Colin Kaepernick, a man who has incredible wealth, who lives an incredibly privileged lifestyle, is probably earning about $10 million a year to be a spokesperson for a revolution. And there is incredible irony in all of it. This country has made him a very wealthy person, and yet he despises America and all it stands for, and the system that makes him wealthy. So the irony abounds on the left, but I do believe that the president, if he sticks to the message he laid out in that speech, will win re-election in November.
Frank, what I enjoyed about what he was saying over the weekend, and I can't recall exactly which place he delivered it, but when he called it the Garden of American Heroes or American, he called it a special word, but I love the concept that it's all America, like even Amelia Earhart. And I like the way that it encompasses everybody, just not generals that were in some military war.
Yeah, that's right. I think what we're seeing now is a war between, and I think Ben points it out perfectly when he calls it a revolution. It's exactly what it is, except that I would use the phrase counter-revolution. The revolution that established a paradigm of personal freedom, of individual freedom, simply hasn't sat well with folks who like things like socialism, which is the exact opposite of personal freedom. And they are attempting to undo what happened in 1776 and what happened in the writing of the Constitution. This is the most serious challenge we've ever had, perhaps in some ways even more serious than the Civil War, because the Civil War, in many ways, the Confederates, though they were horrible in what they tried to do in preserving slavery, I think they wanted to retain certain essences of the Constitution. This is an attempt to completely overthrow the basis of American freedom and the basis of individual liberty as expressed in the Constitution and the Bill of Rights.
You know something, Ben? I'm thinking as Frank is talking there, we had the American Revolution in the late 1700s. We had the Civil War of the United States in the 1860s. And now 150 years later, it's almost like another civil war finding itself. Is this common for nations like every 100 or 150 years to try and rediscover themselves and anchor themselves in who they are?
Well, I'd go further than that. It may be common for each generation to go through some level of this. This generation, it's not a mistake to me that you see a couple of timing trends that converge. We had the collapse of the Soviet Union 30 odd years ago, and we have a generation that's grown up without an understanding outside of watching Venezuela, which apparently gets ignored by this generation, without an understanding of how evil socialism is and communist and Marxist ideology is, how destructive it is and murderous it is, and how every one of these regimes becomes a fascist totalitarian regime. In New York City and other cities, you had tremendous success over the last 25 years in reducing crime. So you've had an entire generation grow up with moderate levels of crime. And New York City's been a model for a large city in terms of its low crime rate for the last 15, 20 years due to the success of Rudy Giuliani and Michael Bloomberg and their policing campaigns. But the youth of these cities don't understand what New York was like in the 70s and 80s, how bad it was when there were 5, 6, 7 murders a day. But they're learning real quick because we're already back from under 1 murder a day on average, which is phenomenal in a city the size of New York. We're already back to those 80s level of crime infecting the streets of New York. And so there has to be an awakening among the youth of this nation of the ramifications of these ideologies. They sound so pleasant. It sounds so great to have universal basic income and everything free, and to have no police to worry about hassling you on the street, until you realize the ramification of that is so evil and destructive and hazardous to your health. And that lesson is being learned very quickly right now on the streets of most northern cities.
Yeah, it truly, and Frank, Ben points this out great about what is happening in our major cities. I mean, you look at New York City under de Blasio, and you look at what's going on in Chicago after Rahm Emanuel left, and these big Democratic mayors, big cities under Democratic mayors in leadership, they are failing miserably. And people, I think, across the country, they're waking up, at least the flyover states, the middle America, they get it. And I would say the vast majority of the people in these big cities, they get it too, but they're afraid, I think, to voice their opinion for fear that they might be attacked, Frank.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. Look, the problem is that the left has been extremely clever in their long-term strategy. While the right and the center tends to talk about politics in election years, the left has talked about politics in terms of taking over the media and taking over academia. As a result, you have at least 2 generations of Americans primed to believe left-wing nonsense. You have a media, and let's not underrate the significant influence of China, both in terms of academia, the Confucius Institutes they have on colleges, and China's takeover of a lot of our cultural centers, such as the Hollywood, and even some of the companies that owned parts of the news media. And they have used that influence very strategically, very powerfully, and very effectively.
Yeah, we're going to get into more of China in our next segment. And boy, you talk about a master tease there, Ben. Frank is setting it up beautifully because, with Hollywood and everything, because they're afraid to go against China, and the NBA, they're afraid to go against China. And China's got this hidden club holding over them. Boy, something that's not on our sheet. I just remembered we got to talk about Epstein and what's going on with Maxwell too, because that's going to be something. So we'll put that on our sheet later. But go ahead, weigh in on that, Ben.
Well, China is the issue of our day, and we have unfortunately been bought and paid for by the Chinese. They understand what drives the politics of this country is economics. We're all guilty of it. I'm guilty of buying Chinese products. Everyone is. I've made a conscious attempt in recent time to avoid Chinese products to the extent possible. It's difficult to do, because so much of what we have done is turn virtually all of our manufacturing over the Chinese and their cheap labor. We have to move away from China because they're a nefarious state. I was one of those who believed 30 years ago that China would be forced to abandon its total control and give liberty to its people over time. I was wrong. I was dead wrong. The Chinese government, the Communist Party, has not given up control. It is evil regime right now as it ever has been in terms of the control of its people. It has now destroyed the independence that the people of Hong Kong should have had for another 20, 25 years. And it is a nefarious regime that we have to own up to. And we finally have a president willing to take them on. frankly, we need to forget about the phase 1, phase 2 deal where they buy a bunch of our stuff and move to a permanent adversarial relationship where we impose tariffs that increase over time to wean Americans off of China. There are lots of alternatives for cheap labor around the world, whether it's Vietnam, India, Thailand, all sorts of countries that are available, Indonesia. And so if cheap labor is what we desire, to have cheap goods, well, we can go elsewhere outside of China, and we need to do that.
That was Mr. Ben Brunson, and he's the author of the Falstaff, Enigma, and Esther, Sling. You can find Ben at benbrunson.com, amazon.com. Mr. Frank Vernuccio, he's the voice of the American Analysis of News and Media and the Minute Report for America. You can find Frank at usagovpolicy.com. Thank you to all of our radio affiliates across the country. KEYS down in Corpus Christi. We want to thank you for carrying our program, and many others across the country. And on YouTube, SoundCloud, and AUN TV Network. We're taking a break. We'll be back.
You're listening to Wehman, Brunson, and Vernuccio, Inside the News.